People think the truth only dies in conflict zones, but this happened in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, among warehouses and the logistics arteries of America.
5:12 a.m. Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. A residential street still dark. Snow unmoved on driveways. Porch lights glowing against frozen air. Inside one house, a woman known across the city as a quiet, reliable civic figure was awake, standing near a kitchen counter, holding a phone that had not rung. Outside, unmarked vehicles had already taken position. Federal teams were in place before the first neighbor stirred. The city itself appeared ordinary. More than 50,000 residents, many from the Somali community, living among schools, apartment complexes, and small storefronts that had grown over decades of immigration and civic development. The woman who led much of that growth had spent years in public view. She attended neighborhood meetings, signed housing grants, posed beside families during winter food drives, and spoke about opportunity with measured calm. Her name appeared on charity plaques and municipal records. There was nothing in her public life that suggested urgency, conflict, or danger. The front door opened under force. Flashlights cut through the hallway. Body armor brushed against furniture. The calm image that had defined her reputation ended in a single moment as federal agents moved inside. Hand restraints were secured. A warrant was read. The words were procedural and controlled, but the meaning was not. Allegations tied to human transport, controlled substances, and financial routing were listed in sequence. In the kitchen doorway, her husband stood still, hands visible as officers passed him without comment. Within minutes, the house was sealed as a search location. Outside, parallel operations were unfolding across the region. Multiple properties, multiple warehouses, and several administrative offices were being entered at the same time. The timing was not accidental. This was the result of months of coordinated intelligence, with one objective guiding every movement. Nothing connected to the network would be allowed to shift or disappear. Inside a small home office, agents began opening drawers and cabinets that looked no different from any other municipal worker's workspace. What they found were not letters or family photographs, but shipping records, customs templates, refrigerated cargo manifests, and routing schedules. Everything was labeled, organized, and filed with care. Nothing appeared rushed or chaotic. The documents carried the structure of a legitimate logistics operation. One computer, hidden behind a false panel inside a desk, drew attention. It was encrypted, protected by layers of security that exceeded anything used for routine civic administration. When technicians accessed the data, a different picture emerged. What appeared on the screen was not a simple partnership with a freight company, but a full transport architecture. Containers were logged by serial number. Routes were mapped across multiple states. Each movement was tracked by timestamp and destination. Declared cargo values were listed alongside separate, hidden entries that never appeared on official paperwork. The items being moved were not consumer goods. People were listed. Chemical compounds were listed. Cash movements were listed. Every shipment was cataloged with the precision of an industrial supply chain. Some containers were marked for temperature-controlled transport. Others were designated for sealed storage. Each code corresponded to a movement that had already occurred or was about to begin. Across 5 states, more than 100 containers had been tracked through this system. On paper, their combined declared value exceeded $100 million. In the encrypted files, those same containers carried an entirely different accounting. Human cargo, synthetic narcotics, financial transfers routed through foundations and development programs. 2 shipments stood out. One container had been declared as frozen agricultural goods arriving from the Middle East, routed through Minneapolis, and scheduled for delivery to a warehouse that did not exist on public records. Inside the encrypted ledger, it was marked with a separate notation. 80 individuals. Another shipment, tied to a parallel route, was listed under a different temperature code. 30 miners. Both were already in motion. From 2 additional containers flagged by the same system, analysts identified more than 2 metric tons of synthetic opioids and cocaine compounds hidden within legitimate cold chain freight. The estimated value exceeded hundreds of millions on the illicit market. Yet the narcotics, as large as they were, did not represent the most urgent threat. The people did. Coordinates showed drop points in multiple Minnesota cities. From there, transport paths branched outward to international destinations connected to labor and processing networks beyond U.S. oversight. The financial side was just as structured. A web of nonprofit suppliers, food distribution companies, and development trusts had been used to move tens of millions of dollars without raising alarms. Customs officials had approved shipments. Licensed trucking firms had moved containers. Every step carried valid paperwork. That was what made it work. The operation was not hidden in darkness. It existed inside the normal flow of regulated commerce, wrapped in documentation and public credibility. Containers labeled as aid shipments crossed borders. Trucks moved through inspection points. Payments traveled through recognized banks. Nothing about the surface suggested risk. Yet one shipment, carrying nearly 80 people inside a refrigerated steel box, was already on its way toward a destination where there would be no record of arrival. Federal command issued an immediate containment order. The route was locked. Transport units were redirected. The container was flagged for interception before it could be handed off to the next link in the chain. There was no public alert, no sirens, no announcements. Only quiet messages passing between agencies as the system that had been trusted for years was forced to stop. The investigation was no longer theoretical. It was now measured in hours, temperature readings, and the remaining oxygen inside a sealed metal container moving through Minnesota. The coordinated response did not begin with noise. At 4:52 a.m., 12 unmarked vehicles rolled into position beneath a low winter sky. Across Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, Brooklyn Park, and Rochester, more than 700 federal and state officers took their places around 9 separate targets. Warehouses, storage yards, transport hubs, and administrative offices were all surrounded at once. Each location had been mapped room by room, entry by entry, based on 18 months of surveillance, shipping data, and financial analysis. The goal was simple. No movement. No warning. No escape. When the breaches came, they were controlled and fast. Flash devices were used to disorient, not destroy. Teams moved through corridors with rehearsed precision, calling out positions, clearing doorways, securing stairwells. At 2 sites, armed guards attempted to move toward exit points but were stopped before they reached the perimeter. None were killed. 2 were injured. The operation continued without pause. At the Minneapolis Freight Hub, one of the largest refrigerated facilities in the region, agents entered a storage wing dedicated to cold chain cargo. The air inside was dense and metallic, filled with the low mechanical pulse of industrial cooling units. Rows of steel containers sat in silent alignment, each marked with barcodes, destination labels, and inspection stamps that suggested routine commercial use. One container, identified as C-4477, showed irregular temperature readings. The condensation pattern along its surface did not match frozen meat or produce. Some sections were too warm, others dangerously cold. Technicians verified the anomaly against digital logs, then signaled for a controlled opening. When the doors were unsealed, the contents were not boxes or pallets. 80 adults emerged slowly, their movements stiff and unsteady. Dehydration had left their skin pale. Cold exposure had numbed their hands and faces. One woman was visibly pregnant. Another man's fingers were dark with frostbite. They had been sealed inside for more than 30 hours with limited air and no light. Medical teams moved in immediately. Thermal blankets were wrapped around shoulders. Oxygen monitors were clipped to fingers. Water was given in measured amounts to avoid shock. None of the individuals were treated as detainees. They were placed into warming units and assessed for hypothermia and respiratory distress. Each told a similar story. They had been promised factory or warehouse jobs. Each had paid thousands of dollars to a broker in East Africa. They were flown to Latin America, transported across the southern U.S. border, then driven north under the belief they were nearing their destination. At a transfer point, they were directed into a steel container, told it was part of the final leg of their journey. The doors closed. The temperature dropped. Hours passed without explanation. At a secondary warehouse in Brooklyn Park, another team moved through a secured storage wing. Inside a locked refrigeration chamber, they found 16 vacuum-sealed packages marked with a symbol that matched entries from the encrypted logistics files. Laboratory technicians later confirmed the contents as a synthetic opioid compound, weighing nearly 10 kilograms in total. It was not the largest seizure of the morning. In an aging container parked deeper inside the complex, officers found 30 children. There was no sound when the doors opened. Some were wrapped in thin blankets. Others sat pressed together, holding hands. One girl, no older than 9, spoke a single word when she saw the uniforms. Help. Medical personnel entered quietly. Heat packs were applied. Small oxygen masks were fitted. No one rushed. A physician later noted that none of the children were crying. They were not panicked. They were exhausted, waiting for something to change. At the Central Command Center, screens showed every location as it was cleared. Containers secured. Suspects restrained. Victims transferred to care units. There was no celebration. The room remained subdued, focused on verification and safety checks. The operation had succeeded in stopping one shipment, but the network that had sent it had been active for years. Somewhere beyond the state, other containers, other routes, and other records still existed, each one representing decisions that had already been made and lives that had already been placed inside the system. The focus shifted from cold steel to paper. In a secured conference room near the Minneapolis field office, tables were lined with boxes of records, digital drives, and printed ledgers collected from every rated location. 12 years of financial and logistical history sat in quiet stacks against the wall. This phase did not involve uniforms or entry teams. It involved accountants, analysts, and forensic specialists trained to follow transactions that were designed to look ordinary. The central entity under review was a logistics and development group tied to a network of civic trusts and municipal programs. On the surface, the organization's filings were precise. Tax records balanced. Grant reports were complete. Charitable distributions matched approved budgets. Independent audits showed no irregularities that would normally trigger concern. When those records were layered together, a pattern began to appear. Between 2013 and 2025, more than $180 million had moved through a web of foundations, storage contracts, refrigeration maintenance agreements, and community development grants. 61 recurring payment loops were identified. Funds left one civic account, passed through a logistics subsidiary, disappeared into a private consulting firm, and returned as infrastructure funding. On paper, each step was legal. In practice, it created a closed circuit that allowed money to circulate without being questioned. Small charges were scattered throughout thousands of invoices. Fuel surcharges, temperature calibration fees, seasonal storage adjustments. Individually, the amounts were minor. A few thousand here, 10,000 there. Over 12 years, those additions exceeded $40 million. The transfers were not designed to draw attention. They were designed to blend into volume. One senior forensic accountant, reviewing the figures, noted that the structure was not built to generate profit in a traditional sense. It was built to move funds without leaving obvious trails. Further analysis revealed routing connections to 3 overseas partners and 9 domestic intermediaries. None of the entities were illegal on their own. None were under sanctions or flagged for violations. Yet their names appeared repeatedly alongside the same refrigerated shipment cycles tied to the seized containers. The pattern was consistent. Each time a cold chain route was scheduled, the same consulting firms, maintenance vendors, and shipping brokers appeared in the financial background. They were not coordinating logistics. They were providing the paperwork that made the logistics possible. Oversight agencies had reviewed these organizations regularly. Reports showed that compliance checks were performed. Signatures were verified. Financial consistency was confirmed. What was never examined was the physical reality of what those forms represented. Inspectors audited numbers. They did not open containers. The room grew quiet as analysts compared invoice timestamps with known transport dates. On several occasions, approval signatures were recorded within minutes of when survivors later described the moment the doors closed and the temperature dropped inside a steel box. No one had written anything that sounded dangerous. The language was administrative. Phrases like off-cycle inventory, priority routing, and cold capacity allocation appeared again and again. They were neutral terms, professional terms. Yet each mapped precisely to shipments that now carried human and chemical cargo instead of food. For investigators who had spent decades trusting regulatory frameworks, the realization was difficult. The system had not been bypassed. It had been followed. Grants had been approved. Contracts had been signed. Audits had been completed. Every step had been documented. And within that documentation, 80 people had died in previous transport cycles, their identities still being traced, their families still waiting for confirmation. The evidence did not point to a single act of corruption. It pointed to a structure that allowed harm to exist inside legitimacy. The more the numbers aligned, the clearer it became that the operation had not depended on secrecy. It had depended on respectability. The investigation moved from spreadsheets to people. In a rehabilitation center on the edge of Minneapolis, those removed from the containers rested beneath soft lights and heavy blankets. Medical staff monitored hydration levels, circulation, and respiratory function. Counselors sat quietly nearby, offering presence more than questions. These were not case numbers. They were individuals who had survived prolonged cold, confinement, and uncertainty. Among them was a 41-year-old mechanic who had left his home after paying a broker nearly $8,000 for what he believed was a manufacturing job. He described being moved through multiple countries, each transfer handled by strangers who took his documents and returned new ones. He did not speak with anger. He spoke with fatigue. The journey, he said, had slowly erased his sense of being treated as a person. Another survivor, a woman in her 20s, had expected office cleaning work and a chance to send money home. Instead, she found herself in a system where every mile traveled reduced her identity to a line on a manifest. She described the fear not as panic, but as something constant and quiet. After days without light or fresh air, people stopped crying because it took too much energy. Doctors later reported patterns across the group: severe dehydration, cold exposure, stress fatigue. The damage was not always visible on the surface. It had accumulated gradually, the result of being treated as cargo rather than human. Their accounts were consistent. Each had been promised employment. Each had paid a broker. Each had been routed through the same chain of transportation. Each path led back to the same refrigerated logistics network. The figure that investigators had been tracking remained fixed. 80 individuals confirmed to have died in prior coal transport cycles. Their names were still being verified. Their families were still unaware of where their journeys had ended. The 30 children rescued during the operation were placed under extended protective care. Many did not speak. Some drew pictures. Others held onto small blankets or soft toys, keeping close to their caregivers. Recovery would not be measured in days. It would be measured in years. For the agents who had opened the containers, one memory returned repeatedly. Not the machinery. Not the steel walls. The silence. A senior case officer later said that wrongdoing is often expected to reveal itself with noise or confrontation. This one had arrived wrapped in paperwork and routine. That was what made it difficult to process. As survivors rested under medical supervision, the larger investigation continued to unfold around them. Interviews, digital records, and archive communications were still being reviewed, each one adding detail to a structure that had allowed people to disappear without drawing attention. What had been uncovered was no longer just a series of illegal shipments. It was a system that had turned trust into a shield. Part 4. The investigation moved from spreadsheets to people. In a rehabilitation center on the edge of Minneapolis, those removed from the containers rested beneath soft lights and heavy blankets. Medical staff monitored hydration levels, circulation, and respiratory function. Counselors sat quietly nearby, offering presence more than questions. These were not case numbers. They were individuals who had survived prolonged cold, confinement, and uncertainty. Among them was a 41-year-old mechanic who had left his home after paying a broker nearly $8,000 for what he believed was a manufacturing job. He described being moved through multiple countries, each transfer handled by strangers who took his documents and returned new ones. He did not speak with anger. He spoke with fatigue. The journey, he said, had slowly erased his sense of being treated as a person. Another survivor, a woman in her 20s, had expected office cleaning work and a chance to send money home. Instead, she found herself in a system where every mile traveled reduced her identity to a line on a manifest. She described the fear not as panic, but as something constant and quiet. After days without light or fresh air, people stopped crying because it took too much energy. Doctors later reported patterns across the group: severe dehydration, cold exposure, stress fatigue. The damage was not always visible on the surface. It had accumulated gradually, the result of being treated as cargo rather than human. Their accounts were consistent. Each had been promised employment. Each had paid a broker. Each had been routed through the same chain of transportation. Each path led back to the same refrigerated logistics network. The figure that investigators had been tracking remained fixed. 80 individuals confirmed to have died in prior coal transport cycles. Their names were still being verified. Their families were still unaware of where their journeys had ended. The 30 children rescued during the operation were placed under extended protective care. Many did not speak. Some drew pictures. Others held onto small blankets or soft toys, keeping close to their caregivers. Recovery would not be measured in days. It would be measured in years. For the agents who had opened the containers, one memory returned repeatedly. Not the machinery. Not the steel walls. The silence. A senior case officer later said that wrongdoing is often expected to reveal itself with noise or confrontation. This one had arrived wrapped in paperwork and routine. That was what made it difficult to process. As survivors rested under medical supervision, the larger investigation continued to unfold around them. Interviews, digital records, and archive communications were still being reviewed, each one adding detail to a structure that had allowed people to disappear without drawing attention. What had been uncovered was no longer just a series of illegal shipments. It was a system that had turned trust into a shield. In the weeks that followed, the case no longer lived inside warehouses or hospital rooms. It lived on a digital map inside the Minneapolis field office, a wide blue display where lines and symbols traced routes across the state. Each dot represented a facility. Each line represented a transfer. Each marker stood for a decision that had once been signed, approved, and trusted. From Minneapolis to Duluth, from Rochester to St. Cloud, the same corridors appeared again and again. 12 primary logistics sites. More than 20 affiliated storage partners. Dozens of contractual intermediaries who believed they were supporting routine transport and development work. On paper, nothing appeared unusual. On the map, the repetition told a different story. At the center of the network sat the same civic-linked logistics structure that had moved funds, containers, and contracts for years under the language of growth and community investment. Housing initiatives, workforce grants, and refrigerated infrastructure projects all connected back to the same financial orbit. None of it looked criminal in isolation. Together, it formed a system that had allowed people to vanish. Analysts confirmed the timeline. 80 lives lost across earlier transport cycles. 30 children recovered only because one container drew attention. 18 facilities directly tied to the chain. Each number was read aloud in the command room. No one responded. A senior field director stood before the display for a long moment before speaking. The operation, he said quietly, had not been hidden. It had simply never been examined. Reports were drafted. Reviews were ordered. Additional facilities were flagged for inspection. Financial records were prepared for international tracing. Public statements emphasized accountability and reform. Yet those who had worked inside the case understood that new procedures could not erase what had already occurred. The families of the unidentified victims would wait for answers that could take months to arrive. Communities across the state would struggle to understand how something so damaging had existed beside ordinary civic life. The records showed no dramatic breach of law, only steady compliance with rules that had never asked the right questions. When the digital map was finally shut down, the room emptied in silence. Files were sealed. Evidence was logged. Outside, the winter sky over Minnesota looked calm and undisturbed, the kind of stillness that suggests order and safety. Those who had seen the routes, the containers, and the records understood something else. Peace is not always the absence of harm. Sometimes it is only the absence of awareness.